In this episode, I'm joined by Coyne, who is an Honorary Research Fellow in Philosophy at the University of Exeter. And he is also the author of Hans Jonas, Life, Technology and the Horizons of Responsibility. In this episode, we discuss the philosophy of Hans Jonas alongside discussions on Heidegger, ethics, ecology, technology and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making this work possible. And if you would like to support Hermitix podcast or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. Coyne, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Today we are going to be discussing your book, Hans Jonas, Life, Technology and the Horizons of Responsibility. For those who haven't heard of Hans Jonas, which probably will be quite a few people, sadly, he is sort of, I guess, infamously one of Heidegger's quote-unquote children, along with Hannah Arendt, Karl Lewith, and Herbert Marcuse, which is in the book Heidegger's Children. Unfortunately, these thinkers, maybe Arendt and Marcuse get a lot of traction, but Jonas and Lewith don't really get any. You don't hear about these people very often. So I was sort of happy to see your full-length book on Jonas out there. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, Hans Jonas's book, Hans Jonas himself, his philosophy, and your book. But before we jump in, just tell us a little bit about yourself. And, you just told me you've been working sort of seven years just reading and studying Jonas. So, how did it come about that you were so interested in him that this book came to fruition?
Yeah, so it has been several years now. I think about 7. Basically, I stumbled across Jonas at the very end of a master's degree in philosophy. That was at Cardiff University in Wales. And I've been writing about Heidegger pretty much all year through that master's degree, turning every kind of essay that I was set to somehow relate it back to Heidegger. But found sort of certain aspects of his work increasingly frustrating, principally the lack of any engagement with ethics. And sort of alongside that, found that Heidegger's treatment of nature, life, the living body, all of that was kind of inadequate as well. And it just so happened that from reading around Heidegger, reading the secondary literature, I stumbled across the name Hans Jonas. So did as you do, stuck it into Google just to see what came up. And, lo and behold, here was a student of Heidegger's who'd developed a new philosophy of life based around the living body, and who then in his final works had kind of turned that into a kind of ethic of responsibility for life. And this was almost like just sort of the stars aligned for me in terms of my interests, and also just sort of chimed with, as I said, sort of my reservations with Heidegger, and found almost a sort of, it sounds really pretentious to say it, but found almost like somebody that I thought, there's a kind of kindred spirit maybe, or that's sort of an arrogant thing to say, but just that he had already sort of been there, had those thoughts and developed something kind of radical with it. And I just thought, there's someone really interesting here. There's someone overlooked. There's not enough writing on him. He's not well enough understood, at least outside certain countries. And I thought, I really want to spend the time to try and dig down into his thinking, work out how it relates to Heidegger, and try and sort of present it to philosophers as a kind of overlooked contribution to continental philosophy. And so I ended up doing a PhD devoted to Jonas, and then spent some time sort of reworking it. And the upshot of all that is the book, which I'm very pleased to say came out just a couple of months ago.
Very nice. Do you know is there any, well, I'm sure of all the people in the world, you will know, is there any other Hans Jonas English secondary literature, or is yours the first?
Not the first, no. There's a sort of smattering. There have been sort of various articles throughout the year, over the sort of decades, mainly devoted to a particular kind of area of philosophy that his work touches on. So in particular, his work on bioethics, there's a fair few articles in English on that. His work on Gnosticism, which we'll talk about in a bit maybe, is very well known amongst religious scholars, because that was kind of the other sort of, he had sort of one foot in philosophy, one foot in religious studies, basically. And his work in that respect is very well known. And then there have been a couple of sort of earlier books which presented Jonas's work, offered a kind of overview, and mine, in a way, is trying to sort of build on that, I think, take certain themes, certain aspects that I think have been overlooked, and try and offer a more kind of, maybe a richer interpretation that builds on everything that's gone before. So obviously, like with all academia, you never write anything sort of in isolation. It's always in a kind of conversation with what's gone before. And so I hope that this book kind of builds on what's there already.
Okay. That's interesting. I mean, do you know when the last sort of full-length book on Jonas was published?
Yeah. So of the two in English on him, so there was one that came out in about 2002 by a guy called David Levy, who was a sort of political philosopher, I think based at Middlesex University. So his book was called Hans Jonas, The Integrity of Thinking. And it offered a kind of nice sort of, partly sort of biographical, but also a kind of snapshot of Jonas's thinking. And then 10 years later, a kind of environmental philosopher in New York called Theresa Morris produced then the second monograph, focusing mainly on Jonas's moral philosophy, and in particular how it applies to environmental ethics, which is one of the other sort of key areas in which he contributed, particularly late in life. So between the two of them, they did a really good job of presenting and sort of digging into the literature on Jonas and presenting certain sort of aspects of his work. And then in mine, what I tried to do was present sort of almost everything, everything that I could, not delving too much into the religious studies work. I tried to sort of observe that sort of disciplinary boundary. There's an element to which I had to talk about Gnosticism to make sense of Jonas's kind of jumping off point for his his philosophical system. But for the most part, I tried to sort of bring everything philosophical that he'd written together into this kind of systematic whole, which is something that he always said, that his philosophy worked as a whole, but there was never a sort of final comprehensive statement of it all. And so what I at least tried to do was show how it all fitted together.
Okay.
And how all these various aspects kind of branched off from one another.
Okay. It's interesting. Sort of almost every 10 years, which it just makes me laugh, because if you had an interest in, Jacques Lacan or Gilles Deleuze, you could probably find a couple of books published on them every year. So, it's a rarity. It's nice. But before we jump into the book itself and and Jonas's philosophy itself, I do have to ask you the Hermitix question. You can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick? And as we are talking about a specific thinker, Hans Jonas, we can include him in the room and add 3 more in.
Oh, okay, brilliant. Okay, it's an excellent question. So, I think for me, if I got the chance to listen into a conversation and sort of be a kind of fly on the wall and listen in something, I would almost want it to be something that's personal as much as it is kind of philosophical. And for me, it would heavily involve Jonas, and in particular I would love to have heard him sort of talk to and confront Heidegger over Heidegger's decision to align with the Nazi Party in 1933. So perhaps just as a little bit of kind of background on that. So Jonas is a student of Heidegger. but a Jewish student of Heidegger, for sort of the majority of his life, had to sort of grapple with this anxiety of influence, that his teacher and greatest influence could have morally and politically made such a catastrophic error, and in aligning with the Nazis. And in Jonas's biography, he talks about how he sort of grappled with this, and only once after the Second World War spoke to Heidegger in person, and they danced around the issue of 1933, but never touched on it. And Jonas says he just left disappointed that Heidegger couldn't have come to mention it. So I would love to hear him ask Heidegger why he did that, what he was thinking, how he could have made such a terrible mistake. And because this is a group of three philosophers or thinkers we have to include here, probably the third person, almost as a mediator in this conversation, perhaps to avoid Jonas lamping Heidegger if it got too heated. The mediator would probably be Karl Jaspers, who was a mutual friend of them both, who, as is quite well known, had remained in Germany throughout the Nazi period, but been critical of it, and sort of emerged sort of morally untainted, really. And as a kind of a friend of them both in that unusual position, I think some kind of conversation around 1933 to 45 and Heidegger's involvement in that would be quite a conversation to hear, I think.
Okay. So for you, that conversation is all about, the personal aspects of these philosophers and this sort of black sheep that lies in the heart of, ever since the release of the black notebooks, it's now sort of undeniable. They're black books. It's sort of undeniable. It was sort of stepped around for a few years, I think, in academia, whether or not Heidegger was truly morally on board with Nazism. But I think, it's come to a point where it has to be accepted, and it's always sort of the odd conversation. So I think, and it's, as you say, the ethics is sort of not within Heidegger's philosophy, and Jonas picks it up, in an extremely practical way. So that conversation seems to me to be the sort of, I guess, do you see that ethics as the key progression from, Jonas from Heidegger, where he, that's the point where he begins to see, right, this is what this philosophy really needs?
Yeah, there's certainly, the couple of oversights that Jonas identifies in Heidegger's thinking. The first being, as we said, sort of life, the living body, nature, but equally ethics. And I think in the context of this conversation, I think that's what would be so fascinating to hear. So in particular, Jonas wrote a lecture, or got invited rather to lecture on Heidegger's relation to theology in the 1960s at a big conference on Heidegger and theology. This is at, I think, Drew University in the United States. And he was invited on the basis of being one of Heidegger's former students. And so they thought, well, we'll invite this guy along who's already in America, and maybe he'll give a kind of Heideggerian take on theology and ethics and all these kind of religious sort of issues. Well, Jonas turned up to this conference and gave a kind of excoriating critique of the sort of moral hole in Heidegger's thinking. The fact that, in the sort of religious tradition that he was being asked to speak about, man is hailed as your brother's keeper, whereas in Heidegger's work, man is the shepherd of being, this very abstract, completely sort of ontological duty that we have, whereas there's no sort of ethical accompaniment to this. And he gave this lecture, and it caused a big uproar, and even made newspapers, mainstream newspapers. And then he gave this talk on basically a kind of lecture tour all around Germany. Heidegger was extremely irked by this, as you can imagine. He was still alive at this point, and was almost felt sort of betrayed. But I think, in a way, that whole incident almost shows Heidegger's kind of emotional and kind of ethical immaturity, in a way that he couldn't even imagine why a Jewish former student of his would take issue with his work and the ethical kind of gap in it. There's this major sort of oversight in his thinking. And I think for Jonas, that was one of the key things that had to be sort of stepped past and kind of overcome in a way. And Heidegger almost had this blindness to ethics, and that had fateful, according to Jonas, and I think this is at least partly true, had fateful consequences for his political decisions too. As you say, with the release of the Black Notebooks, sort of 5-6 years ago now, the extent of his commitment to Nazism is kind of, well, unequivocal now, really. I mean, what he thought during that period is now there, published for everybody to read. And whilst it was, of course, already known that he'd pledged allegiance to Hitler and to the Reich, what was always contested was the extent of Heidegger's anti-Semitism. But with the publication of the Black Notebooks, that's now more or less been confirmed that he also harbored anti-Semitic beliefs as well, although these were couched in a very abstract kind of, almost ontological register of Judaism and the Jews being a kind of alien presence in the West, rather than this sort of biological version that the Nazis are propagating. Nevertheless, the anti-Semitism is there. It's undeniable now. And it speaks to, again, this same kind of gap in Heidegger's thinking. And so to hear them sort of thrash this out, I think would be a fascinating conversation to listen into.
Okay. Just sort of for clarification, does Jonas see Heidegger's philosophy as immoral or amoral?
I think, that's an excellent question. I think amoral, probably, yeah. Because the sort of, the key text, let's say, and certainly Jonas regarded Being and Time as the key text in Heidegger's corpus, and almost as the kind of culmination of the existentialism that Heidegger at least drew on in that period. In that book, Heidegger's account of human existence, Dasein, is effectively a kind of a sort of agent acting without any recourse to any kind of norms or fixed norms, at the very least. There's an account in Being and Time of Dasein as, Heidegger's word is caring, so Sorge. But this description of care is, for Heidegger in that book at least, a completely kind of ethically neutral sort of ontologized understanding of care. So for Heidegger, care involves our everyday relations with things. So I care as much about, making my lunch as I do about my mother, because it's purely a mode of relating to beings in the world, rather than a kind of moral understanding of care, of what we ought to care for, what is the appropriate relation of care from one person to another being. For Jonas, I think there's an attempt to rethink care, as Heidegger presented it, as a normatively imbued concept, rather than this sort of ethically sort of barren version that Heidegger offered. So I think, in answer to your question, it's definitely a kind of, there's an amorality in Heidegger rather than an immorality, definitely.
Okay. I'm sure Heidegger will come back in, most definitely. But to sort of begin to, let's say, construct Jonas's philosophy, which luckily for us does actually have some fairly key cornerstones to it. Gnosticism, relationship with nihilism, and ecology or bioethics. But to begin, this is the section you've already stated that in your book you sort of you don't go into it off your own personal reading because it's not your, let's say, like your specialty, the Gnosticism aspect, but it is key. So, what I guess the two questions would be: why does Jonas draw in Gnosticism? Why is this so important for him? And how does he see Gnosticism manifesting itself within the modern world?
That's a great question. So the sort of biographical, if you like, reason for why he encountered it was when he was a student under Heidegger, actually. And Heidegger would hold seminars not only on works of philosophy, but also religious works too. And with Heidegger and a colleague of his, this is in Marburg, back in the sort of mid-1920s, Heidegger's colleague Rudolf Bultmann would run this reading group where they would analyze from a kind of existential point of view various philosophical and religious texts. And Jonas encountered the Gnostic texts during these seminars and wrote his first kind of attempt at offering a sort of existential analysis or an existential kind of reading of the Gnostic texts, which were available at that time. More have been discovered since, by the way. And when he sort of used Heidegger's kind of framework, the account of the individual thrown into the world, confronted with their own death, their being toward death, living with the anxiety of living without kind of fixed norms and fixed structures and a fixed way of life. When Jonas took that kind of existential component that he'd been taught by Heidegger and used that as a kind of interpretative lens to read the Gnostic texts, he said he found this kind of great kind of synchronicity. There was almost this uncanny match. What he found in these texts, which were written in the 1st century AD, was a early, but particularly how should I put this? An early and particularly kind of vivid and rich and fraught encounter with the same kind of existential themes that Heidegger was talking about. But this was taking place in the 1st century AD, so the terminology used was different. It was religious, heavily influenced by Christianity, of course. And what he thought he found there was a particular kind of anxious voice, almost a kind of existential voice emanating from this group of religious believers in the 1st century. And he thinks that this kind of had a kind of significance for the period as a whole. Because if you ask, well, what could allow for a religion such as this to kind of take root and to grow and become a pan-Mediterranean phenomenon? Admittedly, it already only ever had a fair few sort of adherents, but they were spread across really the entire Mediterranean world. So when you ask what allowed for this to happen, how could this come to be? He sort of offers a kind of historical analysis, which is the collapse of the classical Greco-Roman world based around the idea of the Greek city-states, the polis, and the Roman Republica. That collapse inaugurated almost a kind of crisis of belief, a crisis of orientation and grounding in the Mediterranean. All those fixed certainties about what constituted the good life, how it was to be attained through the polis or the Republica, the place of the polis and the Republica within the cosmos as a whole. This whole sort of worldview of the classical Greco-Roman world is shaken to the core by the loss of the Roman Republic and its transformation into an empire. And Jonas thinks that with the kind of hammer blow that the classical worldview took, it opened the space, socially speaking, culturally speaking, for these more radical kind of religious sects to take hold, and there were a variety of very strange kind of sort of sects and cults and religious kind of groups that grew up at this time. But Gnosticism stands out as one of the most kind of rich, the most kind of interesting of these. So he works out this kind of historical almost account for how this could come to be. And so basically identifies this early sort of proto, almost existential movement as being the result of a kind of loss of faith, if you like, in the fixed Greco-Roman worldview. Now, this was sort of the early focus of Jonas's work, but you asked then about how he sort of applied this to the modern world. And the answer is he did a kind of a flip. He almost kind of turned around the interpretative sort of process that he was following, which was an existentialist reading of the Gnostic texts. And he kind of turns it around and said, okay, well, what is it about the existentialist text that is Gnostic? How is it that this particular philosophical framework, which is nominally secular, emerging in late modernity, how could it chime? How could it sort of have this synchronicity with this religious movement 2,000 years earlier? And the kind of parallel that he draws is that existentialism of the 1920s and 30s, so particularly in Heidegger's sort of formulation of it, is another kind of nihilistic response to a crisis. So there's a kind of shared crisis afflicting both late modernity and the period of antiquity that the Gnostics were sort of grew in and grew as a movement in. And so this leads Jonas really to his sort of critique of modernity, leads him on this kind of questioning of how is it that this particular kind of nihilistic movement of modern existentialism could have come to be, and what is the crisis that led to this?
Because it seems that there's sort of a mirror between, the inherent sort of Gnostic worldview in that there's a separation between the Gnostic worldview specifically, meaning that, well, understanding that there is a separation between the divine and matter. So there's this sort of strange bleakness where with Jonas you think, oh, he's bringing in Gnosticism, we might be able to have some hope because this is with, from within, after the death of God. This is someone who's once again toying with the idea of God. And yet you read further on, and due to the fact it's a Gnostic outlook, we do have God once again, but we're completely separate from him. So we're sort of thrown back into that same tumult as being completely separate from God or having a dead God. Is there a significance there for Jonas with respect to using Gnosticism in the modern world with regard to our connection with God? Is there something different in that he sees as poignant to our situation?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, for the Gnostics, this vision of God as totally alien to the world that you and I are part of, that we can see and touch and smell, the physical world. God is utterly alien to it, and not only in the kind of Judeo-Christian sense of a kind of transcendent creator deity, but even something far more removed than that. Because in the Gnostics, the creator is this sort of malign demon, the demiurge, which is possibly a part kind of influenced by the Platonic idea of the creator who's not a god, but another kind of being. So for the Gnostics, the God is wholly removed from the world, didn't even create it, and our connection to it for the Gnostics is merely that we have a kind of shard, if you like, of a shard of the God, almost a kind of a small kind of vestige of it, but trapped within a body that is to be abhorred on a world that is abhorrent. So in terms of Jonas's attempt to kind of overcome that in terms of thinking about God, he does, and this actually isn't something I touched on in the book because I, as I say, tried to sort of keep a little bit away from the religious side of his output. But for him, if God is to be rethought and to be understood in a non-Gnostic sense, it's almost the kind of very inverse of the Gnostic God. So he introduces this, he calls it a myth of a God, because he accepts that it's not something you could ever prove, but he introduces it almost as a kind of story, a myth that we could believe in, of a God that created the world, so in contrast to the Gnostics, but is wholly immanent to that world and wholly to be identified with it. So there's a very sort of strong similarity here with Whitehead's understanding of God, and perhaps some earlier kind of versions of thinking about God from German idealism as well. But basically the idea being that God was the original, the one being, and gave themselves over, transformed themselves into the world that we can see and hear and touch, the physical world. And that everything that kind of comes to be in that world is a manifestation of God. There's a strong Spinozist kind of strain here you might have detected, where this God is becoming. So everything that happens on the world is a happening to God as well. And yeah, as I say, where God is wholly to be identified with everything that physically is and physically becomes. So he presents this as a kind of myth, as I say, almost something that he would like to believe if he could, but perhaps being a bit too modern, maybe can't quite believe, I'm not sure. But yeah, so if there is to be a God, it has to be rethought along those lines. The creator who's immanent to the world.
So then, in relation to his critique of modernity, does he see the modern world as sort of an antagonist against this God?
I think there's a connection to be drawn, which is that he sees, so the modern world, which through the kind of ever increasing acceleration of scientific technology is imperiling the living world of which we are a part, of course, and which supports our existence. So he sees modernity, if we identify modernity, at least in part, with that process of scientific, industrial revolution, as imperiling a core part of this God that is becoming, which is the living world, the biosphere. He, for philosophical reasons, defends the idea that living nature is better than non-living nature, that it represents a kind of cosmic achievement almost, and that in modernity's imperiling of that cosmic achievement, we are almost casting a kind of a blow against this God that becomes, insofar as, although of course we too are a part of the God that becomes, we are imperiling the living world of which we are a part, and which is the most kind of rich and value-laden part of the cosmos. And so to that extent, the modern world is almost wounding, if you like, this God that exists in everything and becomes in everything.
So Jonas still retains the Heideggerian criticisms of technology.
Yes, yeah. So this is another part of his kind of, as I say, complicated relationship to Heidegger's thinking. So he says Heidegger had recognized that technology needed to be thought through philosophically, and that its role that it plays in modernity needed to be properly understood. But his criticism, again, of Heidegger in this respect was that, firstly, technology's effect upon the living world, the world of living nature, wasn't properly understood. And secondarily, that Heidegger never developed a kind of ethical response to the problems of modern technology, one of which is, in Jonas's view, the imperiling of the biosphere. And so, once again, there's this kind of sense in which he's taking up a core kind of aspect of Heidegger's thinking, but trying to sort of go beyond it by reinvesting life and ethics into that analysis. And where he sort of differentiates, or how he differentiates himself from Heidegger, falls straight along those lines. So for Heidegger, the problem of modern technology was that it represented a particular way of engaging with beings, of understanding and encountering beings, namely as what he called standing reserve. So more or less as kind of resources, as things to be appropriated into our practical engagements, as kind of, just mere resources or mere tools in our activity. And for Heidegger, the danger here was that that way of engaging with beings had become, or has become, the predominant one, at the exclusion of other ways of encountering beings, whether that is, he would have some resistance to the idea of aesthetically, but aesthetically, religiously, however else beings can be encountered and have been encountered throughout Western history, that's been sort of pushed out to the exclusion of the technological encounter with beings. But for Jonas, the key kind of problem with that analysis is it doesn't say which beings it is more or less appropriate to treat as resources, which beings can be encountered as resources whilst doing a sort of his problem is that analysis doesn't say which beings can be encountered as resources without doing a violence to them, and on the other hand, which beings must not be encountered as resources and treated as mere means to ends. And so here, this is where his kind of almost kind of Kantian moral kind of philosophy comes in, which is that his concern is that human beings, above all, are being increasingly treated as means to ends and not also as ends, which Kant, of course, famously said human beings must, but also that living beings too, and being construed as resources, as matter to just be moved around and integrated into our industrial activity, does a kind of violence to living beings too, which have a good of their own, which have intrinsic value, according to Jonas. Whereas it could be that, I think he would probably be happy to go along with this idea that to treat non-living matter as a resource is not doing it a kind of violence, is not doing it an injustice. But for Heidegger, speaking of it in these terms of, justice, value, ends and not means, is bringing in this whole ethical vocabulary that he just wouldn't countenance. And so for Jonas, that is the kind of overarching concern. How do we use, or how do we rather allow technology to be aligned with our norms and to be used in an ethically appropriate manner?
Do you think then that for Jonas, that's where the idea of the body comes in and why it's so important to him? Because he seems to be moving away from the fairly abstract philosophy of Heidegger, trying to move towards more practical ways of dealing with these questions of being and justice and responsibility. Do you think he begins this by, his ideas of embodiment?
Yeah, embodiment is absolutely key to understanding what is of value in life for Jonas, absolutely. And so the body is, as I said earlier, one of these key oversights in Heidegger's philosophy for Jonas. Now, it must be said that later in life, Heidegger did have some things to say about the living body, or rather, I should say, the lived body, but only very sort of fragmentarily and belatedly. This occurs in the Zolikon seminars, which are his seminars he held with medical doctors in the 1960s. So it only very lately came into Heidegger's thinking. Jonas, writing prior to this, identified it as this kind of gap in Heidegger's thought, because his problem when he was listening to Heidegger's lectures, studying with him, fully kind of on board for a while with this existential analytic of Dasein, which represents Heidegger's early thought. His problem with this was this account of Dasein is not embodied. Where is the body? Where is the physicality to this account of Dasein, of existence? Heidegger really had, in those early years, very little, if at all, anything really to say about this. And Jonas's kind of question was, well, okay, we'll think about the kinds of things that we have to care about. Part of these are physical things, not just health, but also things like nutrition as well. Well, once you start considering these kinds of aspects of our existence that are part of our daily lives, you move on to the terrain of talking about the body and the needs of the body. And so his kind of departure point and his kind of critical point of departure from Heidegger, at least initially, was this, that the human being, Dasein, has to be understood as embodied, as both a lived body, so the body that I am, that I live out in relation to the world through and as, in my relations with things, all of which are embodied and structured by the body, but also the body understood as an organism, for which we can turn to the physical sciences for empirical support and empirical kind of guidance. So his attempt was to try and reintegrate this account of existence into the body and understanding the body as a part of the living world, as an outgrowth of it, just one manifestation of living nature. And so there's this attempt to sort of come up with a new ontology where life plays pride of place, where it is the focal point of the ontology, understanding ourselves as a part of that. And now there is a strong overlap here with another movement going on in Germany around that time in the 1920s, which was life philosophy. So there had already been earlier thinkers like Nietzsche and Bergson from France who had sought to make life one of the sort of focal points of an ontology. And then there were some later thinkers too in the 1920s, figures like Ludwig Klages, who Jonas certainly knew about. And there seems to have been a kind of, it's hard to trace whether there was a direct influence, but perhaps just something in the air, to quote Phil Collins, something in the air of this issue of life that was unaddressed in Jonas's thinking, and which he tried to kind of bring back into the existential analytic.
Yeah, I was going to say, was there a connection there with, life philosophy or is it Leibniz philosophy?
Leibniz philosophy, yeah.
Because, I mentioned in my questions that Jonas directly references Cosmogonic Eros, Klages' text. And, from your research, is there, I'm a big fan of Klages, so this was like, I need to get this in somehow. Is there a big influence there for Jonas, or is it something he sort of just uses as a helpful tool?
I think it's tricky to say because, so there are a few kind of thinkers of that era, sort of the 1920s, who took up this idea of life as, the focal point of an ontology. Klages is one, and another is Oswald Spengler, who wrote The Decline of the West, which was a text actually that Jonas was initially very kind of impressed by. And although he didn't think of it as kind of serious kind of philosophy of, the Husserl and Heidegger and Jaspers, the people that he was studying with and friends with, he still thought that was a kind of a culturally important book from Spengler. So there are references he makes to both Spengler and to Klages in his text, but they are sort of just scattered occasional kind of references. I know Spengler was a big admirer of Jonas's work on Gnosticism, and they exchanged some letters over that. In terms of Klages, Jonas brings in this idea of the cosmogonic Eros to try and account for why life itself might have come to be. Now, I already said that in his religious work, he'd floated this myth of the god who becomes and gives rise to life. So that was his religious attempt to kind of account for the phenomenon of life. In terms of his attempt to provide a more strictly, or perhaps a more philosophical justification, he drew on this idea that Klages had outlined in Cosmogonic Eros, that there is something in being, in matter, in physical stuff, that given the opportunity, given the right circumstances, would lead and would kind of strive is perhaps putting a bit too much of a maybe striving is putting too much of a psychological tint on it, but might lead or might sort of fall in the direction of giving rise to life. So that what he's trying to provide is a kind of non-mechanical account for why life might have come to be. And this is his postulate. And this is where he draws on Klages to try and make some sense of this idea.
Okay. Jumping back to we touched a little on nature, but one of the things that really interested me while reading your book is that you sort of allude to the fact that, and it's one thing that I really liked actually as a philosopher who finally sort of takes a clear step to state a position, is that Jonas's politics of nature, what sort of, I guess you could say, what should be done and how we should interact with it, is often considered quite authoritarian. So I was wondering if you could go into this, because I found this, extremely interesting.
Yeah, so this is the most contested kind of part of his thinking, really. And all of his friends in the Frankfurt school, like Habermas, really, sort of gave him a real talking to about this bit of the book, because Jonas was never in his earlier work, he's not that concerned with politics. His concerns are, as I say, ontology, and in particular the position of life in an ontology, and also ethics. But since his concern, as I say, with modern technology was that through the process of industrialization, we've created this kind of runaway system of consumption, which is not impossible, but very hard to kind of rein in and control. As we know from, it's been 50 years now since those sort of landmark first reports on the consequences of industrial life for the planet, the limits to growth and all that kind of stuff. So we've known this for a long time. It's hard to kind of place any kind of constraints on our industrial activity. And it was at this point that Jonas's interest in politics comes in. It was with that question that his interest in politics comes in. And whilst he had friends who were political theorists, Hannah Arendt, most notably, he kind of tried something a bit different, which was basically reminiscent, in my opinion, of Aristotle's text, The Politics, where Aristotle compares the various competing political systems that existed in the Greek city-states and sort of weighs them up as to which best allows for the good life. Jonas's attempt is similar, except what he's now concerned with is not just the good life, but in preserving any kind of civilized human life, in preserving the possibility of human life. And of course, nature as such, since it provides the ecosystems in which we are supported by and belong to. So his concern is not with the good life, but rather with that there be some kind of life that allows for good human life. So he sort of does a kind of comparative analysis of the two leading political systems that there were in the 1970s, which were the kind of liberal capitalist West, and then the communist Soviet bloc, and China, of course. And it's a very kind of, it's a crude way into a political theory, and that's probably where he comes unstuck. But it's driven, as I say, by this kind of genuine concern, which is how can we make sure that there is the possibility of good human life? And he does a kind of comparative analysis, and his concern with capitalism is more or less that the process of consumption is almost inherent to that political economy. Whereas his reading of communism is that it, at least in principle, can impose certain restraints on the consumptive productive process. Now, in practice, I don't think his judgment actually kind of stood up anyway, because with the fall of the Soviet Union, it became apparent how much the ecology of the Soviet Union had been mismanaged, and that terrible mistakes have been made. And, you know, of course, there were things like Chernobyl, but also the complete kind of destruction of natural spaces. So I think empirically he was wrong on that, but the moral worry which was picked up at the time was that because he had framed the political sort of question of the day as which will best allow us to survive and provide for a good human life, he went in for the more authoritarian of the two regimes as the one best able to provide that chance for the future. So his mistake, I think, was framing it in a sort of overly simplistic way. But it was driven, as I say, by this very pragmatic question and his desire to have a kind of answer, so that his ethic of responsibility for life could be sort of transposed into a politics of responsibility.
Okay. So this might be oversimplifying it, but, you know, in what sense could one utilise Jonas's philosophy as a means to sort of tackle the climate crisis that we're seeing at the moment?
Well, I think there are still bits of it that are worth salvaging. The politics of his the politics part of his philosophical system, there are bits that are still worth salvaging. So one was that he was a kind of early adherent of the precautionary principle, which has since been brought in, albeit in weaker forms, to legislation in the European Union, for example. Then there are other kinds of perhaps more then there are some other suggestions that are less easy to translate into policy, but I still think are politically very interesting, one of which is his desire to use visions and fictions and forecasts of the future to kind of heighten our sense of the possibilities ahead of us, and indeed the likely outcomes of our current course of action. So his hope was that we would use our imaginative faculties to try and conjure up where the world might be if we continue in this course, and what other kind of world might we have if we took a different course. And this he called the heuristic of fear. And the reason he gave it that name was that he thought that the faculty of fear is very useful in trying to plan for the future, because if you can identify something to be fearful of, upon further examination, you can kind of see whether that's something to be avoided. So, for example, we might imagine a future based on our current economic activity and industrial activity of a world where wildlife is enormously depleted, where pollution and consumption have taken their toll on the living world. So it's effectively become a kind of barren waste. And if we kind of exercise our imagination in this way, we're led to realize that there is something that exists now which we do not want to lose, which is the richness and the plenitude of living nature, not just in its wild forms, but also in the fact that we're able to use it at the moment to feed ourselves with relative ease. And to lose these kind of things would be catastrophic. So the use of our kind of imaginative faculties can play a positive role for Jonas. And this can sort of feed into our actions that we take now, insofar as we think about what could become of our actions and act to try and avoid the worst case scenarios. In terms of the political sort of vehicle for these policies, he only very late in life started to kind of develop a slightly more palatable version of a political system that might enact and deliver on these kind of policies. And so I read through, looking at various texts written toward the end of his life, I kind of read him as moving toward a kind of almost eco-republicanism, where he is making references to certain kind of institutions and ideals of the Roman Republic, as Hannah Arendt had done, of course, as well, and was kind of reformulating those along ecological lines. And so conceiving of self-imposed productive and consumptive limits as a kind of civic duty. And that is the kind of later way in which I read him as moving, but unfortunately it never got fully fleshed out into an actual political theory, alas.
Do you think there's anyone? Has there been anyone who's been directly influenced by Jonas who might have started heading towards fleshing that out?
In terms of it's a good question. So in terms of his political sort of influence, he was hugely influential on the German Green Party, and to a lesser extent on the German Social Democrats and the German Christian Democrats. With the publication of his book, The Imperative of Responsibility, he became almost a kind of intellectual sort of celebrity in Germany. It seemed apparently, with the publication of the book in the 1970s, seemed to speak to this rising kind of environmental consciousness in Germany, which politicians both sort of centre-left and centre-right and green, of course, were all chiming with. And so his book, and through that, he became very well known. And so he did have some maybe kind of informal, impossible to quantify influence on the debates in Germany around the environment in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Certainly the Green Party were highly influenced by him. And unlike the Green Party in the United Kingdom, they have actually held, central government office and held power in coalitions. So there is some sense in which he might have had a kind of influence on politics in Germany. Interestingly, to draw another connection back to Klages here, who Klages was also a influence on the German Green Party, I believe, his book Man and Earth,
Mm-hmm.
or rather, it's a kind of extended essay, Man and Earth, was also picked up by post-war German environmentalists as a kind of proto-environmentalist tract. So that openness to intellectuals, and in particular openness to philosophy, which is a very kind of Germanic trait, means that he may have had some kind of influence on German politics. But in terms of any single political theorist or actual politician who's explicitly tried to take this up, I'm not aware of any myself.
Okay. Where would you advise listeners to begin with Jonas if they would like to read his work firsthand?
Yeah, excellent question. So I mean, most of his output was in essays, and that means, of course, that whilst they're sort of highly readable, you can't get a full sense of his thinking and his interest through any of those. So what I would have to point the reader toward would be either one of his two most important philosophical works. So the two most important are The Phenomenon of Life, which is this attempt, as I say, to rethink ontology from the point of view of life as its kind of foremost focal point. And then there's the work on ethics, The Imperative of Responsibility, which came out about 13, 14 years later. And depending on where one's interests lay, on the ontology side or the ethics side, I would say to pick one of those two books. They're both wonderfully written, kind of works of academic philosophy that you don't sort of get very often, certainly not anymore. I mean, in terms of the breadth of his interests and his learning, I mean, the fact that in The Phenomenon of Life, for example, he can move from an analysis of metabolism and DNA 1 minute to then talking about, the Stoics and Plato the next, bringing in, Greek and medieval thinking, early modern science. It's a real kind of just an incredibly impressive kind of array of historical and cultural sources that he draws on in a way that, unfortunately, most contemporary philosophy has, at least in English anyway, no longer kind of displays. But also, I think in terms of the writing, they're both wonderfully written, and that's one thing I would want to stress to anybody interested in his work, is that he was a fine stylist, and some of the essays and certain sort of passages of the books have this kind of great kind of high rhetoric, which again, most kind of academic philosophy just hasn't even, just wouldn't even dare try, let alone actually succeed in. So stylistically and in terms of the ideas, they're both wonderful texts, and I would say, depending on one's interest, to go for one or the other.
Do you think he did that stylistically to sort of spite Heidegger?
I'm not sure. It's certainly, I mean, it's a very, his style is very sort of classic. It almost fits kind of almost the late 18th century. Some of his sort of rhetorical, his focus on rhetoric and focus on the power of what he's saying, and not merely the ideas of what he says, but the power of the presentation. It almost fits, the kind of great sort of Enlightenment writers. And in a way that makes him kind of stand out to me as an academic philosopher. I mean, there are many reasons that he's been overlooked, but one reason that he should not be overlooked is his particular kind of presentation of philosophy, which is quite unique.
Okay. Is there anything you think we've missed that is key?
Perhaps just maybe the reason that he is an overlooked figure.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of sad when I think the book, obviously, that people might have come across him in would be that one called Heidegger's Children, which I think, I mean, I haven't read it, so, It might be fantastic, it might not, I don't know. But just from first glance, I know not to judge a book by its cover, but even the name Heidegger's Children is sort of patronizing. So I think there's this almost this idea that they've been subsumed into Heidegger as opposed to potentially moving beyond, like Heidegger the Great kind of thing, instead of, well, maybe they are their own people, not just. It's sort of like saying, that someone is a man's wife kind of thing.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of that. So that's Richard Wohlen's book, Heidegger's Children, which is a very polemical text, and it's very enjoyable to read, and for that reason, but is unfair to really the people it studies, because, as you say, it ties them too closely to Heidegger, because what Wohlen is trying to do is basically say that Heidegger's influence over contemporary humanities and social science in America has been a wholly malign one. And he says that partly it was propagated by these thinkers, and look, they're all just Heideggerians, and we should do away with that, forget about them all. So it's a completely polemical and sort of almost fun read almost, but not a fair one. And yeah, it's unfortunate that he has been overlooked otherwise. And I think part of the reason for that is probably that he lost so many decades, I think a good 20 years to, firstly, sort of military commitments, really. So when he fled Nazi Germany in 1933, he went to Israel, or what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, and basically got sort of swallowed up in the kind of the politics and the life of the sort of burgeoning Israeli community there. Then he enlisted in the British Army, spent 6 years fighting in the Second World War, and then once that was over, went back to Israel and got enlisted into the Arab-Israeli War of, I think it's 1947. So it was only after that he then finally, in the 1950s, was able to get a kind of academic post over in North America, by which time he was, a 50-year-old man. So he'd lost a significant chunk of his life to non-philosophical pursuits, although lost is a strong word, had given a significant chunk of his life to non-philosophical pursuits. And also because he ended up in America in the 1950s, bringing with him the education of a 1920s German student of philosophy. He was really a kind of a fish out of water. I mean, eventually, of course, he found the New School for Social Research as a sort of intellectual home, where there were other great German Jewish emigres, Hannah Arendt being one of them. Also later other sort of great figures as well, like Alfred Schutz, Aaron Gurvitch. Leo Strauss was there for a while too. But really, they all form part of this kind of generation who had to leave Germany for political reasons and ended up in a country which was totally inhospitable to their way of doing philosophy. And so, in my opinion, there's a great loss there, because I think in the right sort of circumstances, they could have become another generation of great German thinkers and German Jewish thinkers. But because they were formed this kind of diaspora in a country that at that time was heavily focused on analytic philosophy, they never really were able to achieve their potential. And while some, like Hannah Arendt, of course, achieved some fame and, some sort of sense of recognition, there were others, like Jonas being one of them, but also Schutz and Eric Voegelin maybe as another, who were never sort of able to flourish, really. So I think there's kind of unfortunate biographical and political reasons for why Jonas is one of that sort of generation, I think, of philosophers who never quite could have become as well known as they might have done.
I mean, life philosophy in general, those philosophers all seem to be criminally overlooked. So I wonder if there is a bit of a bias that people, don't warm to that philosophy too much.
Yeah, I mean, there's the political kind of issue with life philosophy, namely that some of its adherents were fairly sort of hard right sort of thinkers, but there's no necessary connection. So, for example, I mean, we could talk about Bergson is a life philosopher, and nobody would kind of take him to sort of task for his political opinions. Then there are, and I would include, well, as I said, Jonas's politics were problematic, but for a different point of view, namely that he was perhaps overly willing to countenance authoritarianism as a solution to the ecological crisis. But there are some thinkers, like Spengler, Nietzsche, of course, where their life philosophy was tied quite heavily to their politics, and that makes them persona non grata, I think, for a lot of academics. And although Heidegger, of course, was an actual Nazi, his philosophical sort of output and influence is rightly, in my opinion, probably perceived as too great to be, cast aside because of his political errors. But the same kind of sort of nuance isn't necessarily allowed to other less well-known thinkers. Where I think you can read somebody like Klages and, maybe take issue with aspects of his politics, but still think that, there's something really of worth in there. But unfortunately, that kind of nuance isn't always allowed in contemporary academia, alas.
Mm-hmm. Whereabouts can we find your book?
Well, if you are studying at a university, so at the moment it's out in hardback and so quite pricey. But if you're studying at a university, you can always sort of request that your library purchase a copy. But if you are willing to splash the cash, it's on, of course, Amazon, Waterstones. You can see a preview on Google Books or just buy it straight from Bloomsbury, who are the publisher. But yeah, I mean, hopefully when the paperback comes out, it should be at a price that anybody interested will be able to buy it. In the meantime, by all means, put a request into your university library and see if they'll get it, because that's what they're there for, after all.
Okay, it seems like a good place to finish up. Lewis Coyne, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, James.